For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? Mark 8, verses 35 to 37. How does the digital era affect our identities? We are familiar with the warnings about the digital era and mental health, attention, cognitive development, bullying, pornography, and so on.
14-year-old Mia was being bullied online, and since her death, Mariano has been campaigning for children to be better protected on the internet.
Young kids, they used to have access to things that we never imagined. Because of the use of algorithms, they were constantly looking for this subject. Even if they are not looking, they will receive the information.
Bullying has evolved over time. If you were getting bullied, it was at school.
Yeah.
It wasn't coming home with you. They weren't calling your house. But now that it's on social media, now you can bully someone after hours, like on the weekends. Like you can do it all 24 hours a day. Mm-hmm. Other people can join in by liking a message or not liking it or whatever.
A new study found that most kids are seeing adult material online by the age of 12, but many of them are actually 10 or even younger.
The transgender culture war rages on. Periodically, we hear in the press that some group or other has begun to identify as animals.
That children in schools across Britain are now identifying as cats, horses, dinosaurs, and in one case, a moon.
Or fictional characters, or perhaps multiple personalities or spirits. Something odd is going on, but when we pause and zoom in, the territory becomes bewildering. What do we even mean by identity? What is an identity made of? Where do our beliefs about this phenomenon come from? It is as disorienting as trying to think about thought. As I will argue, a serious treatment of identity means examining our foundational categories for thinking about what we ourselves are. And what we believe ourselves to be has always also been bound up in what we believe reality to be. When we explore these phenomena historically, it becomes clear that the term identity has emerged only relatively recently. Google's Ngram tool, which allows the user to track the frequency of usage for a term over millions of historic texts, suggests identity emerged into mainstream cultural usage after the two 20th century world wars, accelerating rapidly from the 1960s.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Why? What preceded it? It is my contention that identity has, roughly since the 1960s, come to replace the modern secular self as a byproduct of a fundamental change that began at that point, in which we turned our technologies inward and began applying them to our own minds and bodies. And the digital era encompasses these technologies with which we did so, an era we also call the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or more dramatically, the transhumanist age. It is a central premise of this video that we are already over half a century into this transhumanist era. Meanwhile, the antecedent to identity, the secular self, emerged in tandem with modernity. As for the predecessor concept to the self, this is a term now largely defunct, at least within mainstream public conversation, the soul.
The very idea of human being some sort of natural concept is really going to change.
Our bodies will be so high-tech, we won't be able to really distinguish between what's natural and what's artificial.
Inside our own heads is the most complex arrangement of matter in the known universe.
You might ask yourself, can we get to be superhumans?
Within the Western tradition, These iterations in our ongoing effort to name and make sense of this most distinctively human of phenomena, our capacity for self-reflexive consciousness, are in turn inextricable from the information technologies that have helped to structure our efforts to understand who and what we are. The earliest known references to the soul emerged in tandem with literacy. The modern self cannot be disaggregated from the printing press, and our contemporary understanding of identity emerged in tandem with our entry into the digital era, an era that, as this video will argue, is better understood as a new form of merger with our technologies. In what follows, this video will trace the interlocking story of souls and information technologies, from Plato to our transhumanist era. At each stage, these developments have brought tremendous benefits as well as costs and metaphysical convulsions, and today is no exception. None of what follows is an argument for unplugging the internet, but if we are to survive the latest convulsions, we will need to revisit those ways we have come to apply modernity to ourselves. In its place, we can and must restore the older and fuller understanding of ourselves, not as mere bodies, not as plastic self-actuating identities, or even as data processors, but souls. And in retrieving this fuller sense of what we are, we may yet manage to escape the epistemological cul-de-sac of modernity without losing the gifts modernity has afforded us. Human-machine convergence was once a niche preoccupation for Silicon Valley tech optimists such as Ray Kurzweil, who forecasted that by 2045 humans and machines would merge, delivering untold transformative benefits. As this author has argued, in a sense, this merger has already happened, with hormonal birth control serving as its entry point.
I rather think that the noble experiment of prohibition in this country showed that the behavior of people is, as far as morals are concerned, is not determined by the availability of opportunities for sin, and I firmly believe that the effectiveness of the pill, its availability, will have no significant effect on behavior, moral behavior.
For the first time, with the pill, a medical technology was adopted not to restore normal physiological functions, specifically female fertility, in the name of health, but to interrupt normal functions in the name of individual freedom. This inaugurated a radical transformation in our understanding of what a person is, in which embodied attributes, once understood as irreducible givens, beginning with sex difference, have come to be seen as optional and subject to individual choice and re-engineering. Importantly, inasmuch as women have embraced this technologically enabled understanding of ourselves, in which female fertility is viewed as an option whose default setting is off, we have embraced our own fusion with technology as a precondition for participation in public life. Much of the mainstream social fabric in Western societies is downstream of such technologies. In other words, the default modern Western culture is already a cyborg one. Whether or not you view this as a good thing, and it has brought many benefits, including greater freedom and opportunity for some women to participate in work, study, and public life, this development also represented a profound shift change in our relationship to our technologies and in our beliefs about what it means to be a person. This shift in turn accelerated a further transition from speaking about the self to speaking about identity, a move whose logic and profound consequences I will explore further. But it did not stop with the pill. Its second phase initially appeared in the same decade birth control was legalized, but was universalized much more recently: networked computing. As the pill began to revolutionize identity throughout the West, the U.S. Department of Defense was sponsoring the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, to explore the first networks of information processing machines, with the aim of creating a resilient network in the event of a defense crisis. Roughly half a century and a great deal of development later, the second phase of the singularity began in earnest when Apple produced the first iPhone. On its launch in 2007, Steve Jobs described this innovation as 3 products in one.
3 things: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone.
By 2021, data traffic on mobile networks increased 300-fold. 2 billion more people gained a smartphone, and 5.6 billion new smartphone subscriptions were opened. Smartphones proved to be the digital equivalent of the pill, every bit as intimate, as seemingly indispensable, and as deeply implicated in everyday freedoms and commerce. And as with the pill, the global transformation that has followed their normalization has reshaped politics, culture, sex, family, and even consciousness itself. Most centrally, it has reshaped what we mean when we say identity. For processing, an always-on, networked, handheld device enables every user to turn away from the arbitrary, immediate real-world features of our lives as the principal forces shaping who we are. Instead, it has grown increasingly possible to curate social groups based on interests and affinities, infinitely adjustable virtual avatars, and even erotic and romantic entanglements conducted partly or wholly in a dematerialized digital realm. In this context, identity has begun to work loose from embodiment, family, and other interpersonal relationships, and even in some cases our self-understanding as human beings. But even when unmoored from such familiar anchors, self-curated identities require validation in order to feel real, a dynamic that, in turn, has increased the salience of recognition as a political desideratum.
I'm Jeannie, a virtual avatar created by Union Avatars. I'm here to chat and show what digital humans can do, powered by NVIDIA's ACE. It's pretty exciting. What would you like to know? ACE, or Avatar Cloud Engine, is a suite of technologies from NVIDIA that brings digital humans to life using generative AI. It includes services like Audio Two-Face, which helps me animate my facial expressions based on your voice. It's all about making interactions with avatars more natural and engaging. Pretty cool, right?
It is not a coincidence that identity politics came to mainstream public prominence in the wake of the smartphone revolution. The so-called Great Awakening is generally dated from around 2010, with many researchers linking its emergence directly to mass adoption of social media. Now we are in the early stages of a third convergence with our machines, the onrushing development of the programs colloquially known as artificial intelligence, or AI. These technologies draw on the patterns discernible across vast datasets, granting the models themselves eerie seemingly ability to identify or even predict future patterns on the basis of existing ones. Such systems have been employed in areas as diverse as image generation, medical diagnosis, biometric security, and even criminal law. Most famously, Large language models, or LLMs, such as ChatGPT, respond as if in conversation with human interlocutors, answering questions, systematizing information, and interacting in often surprising ways with questionnaires. Elsewhere, rapid and astonishing AI-powered advances in automation are proceeding everywhere, from manufacturing to transport and defense. LLM usage has already become part of mainstream culture, from management consultancy to students cheating at homework, and even one innovator employing it to approach prospective partners on a dating website. In the developing world, most of us already interact with such technologies regularly. For the most part, the response to such developments is wonder, surprise, and sometimes unease at the range of human functions that might potentially be automated by their advance. Behind the unease lies a far deeper question. Are there any limits to what these machines can do? Is there anything at all about humans that cannot be replicated, and perhaps outclassed, by one of our own inventions? The AI maximalists imagine that there is not. The endpoint of AI development will, they imagine, be artificial general intelligence, a moment at which such models leap from prediction within a specific dataset to a general power to think, after which they will become recursively self-improving. For the optimists, this represents a transformative accelerant of everything we value in human life, or even the means whereby humans create our own successor species. Conversely, pessimists warn that the risks of such a superintelligent machine destroying us are so grave that we should halt all research.
Skynet. Where's the system core? Somewhere in this building?
Skynet. The virus is infected. Skynet.
Skynet is the virus. It's the reason everything's falling apart.
Skynet has become self-aware. In 1 hour, it will initiate a massive nuclear attack on its enemy.
What enemy?
Us! Humans!
Our media is full of different visions of the future. Post-apocalyptic wastelands, sleek space utopias, cyberpunk nightmares. They promise different things waiting for us. Technology might save us from disease or ensure we're victims of our own hubris. It might lead us to strange and wonderful new worlds, or it might show us our wildest dreams are really nightmares. Futuristic ideas on our screens have even inspired real-world technologies. But the same sci-fi gadget might be viewed differently depending on who is watching. For instance, is a transporter a wonder that opens up our access to the world, or a terror that destroys, duplicates, and brings the very self into question? So, which is it? How do we think about new technologies, and what's just over the horizon?
But the most contested question, for boosters and doomers alike, is whether or not human thought and computation will ever amount to the same thing. This is illustrated by the way those existing applications of AI that cause the deepest unease tend to be those that act as if this was so, or nearly so. For example, the Character AI app enables users to create role-playing interlocutors, prompting outrage when AI character versions of murder victims were found to have been created. Such simulated people can have still more troubling sequelae. For example, in February 2024, Sewell Setzer III, a 14-year-old boy from Orlando, Florida, took his own life after forming an intense and highly sexualized relationship with a chatbot he created using Character AI. Elsewhere, common descriptors used online for the Moxie AI-powered companion robot, launched in 2021 to teach emotional intelligence to children, include creepy or even nightmare-inducing.
Come and say goodbye to Moxie.
Why final goodbyes?
The company went bankrupt. Embodied. Baby, what? Oh my God, really?
Baby, it's okay.
I know you like her. She's your friend. But it's gonna be okay, alright? Enjoy the time you have with her now, okay?
Watching TikToks of people saying goodbye to their robots and me just like crying about it, that was not on my bingo card. What a weird world we live in.
We are, claims tech investor Mark Andreessen, literally making sand think. Is this, as Andreessen says, literally true? If so, it surely follows that we just need to make machine computation better, faster, and more aligned, or otherwise complete, in order for artificial intelligence to produce better and more effective thinkers than have emerged as yet from the human species. But, as I will argue in part 2 of this series, this is a profound category error that, in the end, will not aid but impede scientific understanding, and with it, real human progress. Three technology transitions define our era. As we will see, all three represent radical and transformative applications of technology to the human soul. But while this revelation may sound alarming, in truth it exists in continuity with a far longer civilizational trajectory. For our shared and nested surroundings of human consciousness and of reality have always interlocked with our information technologies. More plainly, this is not our first singularity event. The long arc of Western culture tracks a slowly evolving view of our inner lives that developed in tandem with beliefs about the nature of reality and the divine. And this evolution has always been both shaped and transmitted by our information technologies. Of these, reading and writing was always the technology most profoundly linked to the soul. In particular, as Walter Ong describes, literacy appears to be the critical catalyst for a sense of having inner lives, whose activity and topography is distinct from our engagement with the world around us. The historian Adam Garfinkel argues that what Karl Jaspers called the axial age within classical antiquity emerges downstream of the spread of deep literacy in a still small but critical share of the population, and with it, of a new sense of interiority. The first recorded reference to the soul, psyche, in the Western tradition appears in Plato, one of the most profoundly influential philosophers of the axial age. For Plato, and later in modified form Aristotle, the soul was understood as having three parts. Plato sets out his three-part understanding of the soul in Book 4 of the Republic: appetite, spirit, and reason. The first of these, eros, concerns urges and desires such as food and sex. The second, thumos, concerns spirit, courage, passion, and the drive for recognition. The third, logos, Plato situates in the head. Its role is governance of the whole, oriented toward comprehension of the divine order as expressed in the world. And this divine order reflects a crucial corollary. From these earliest conceptions of the soul, it is clear that such self-reflection cannot be separated from how we understand the rest of reality. For both Plato and Aristotle, To be rational, as such, did not connote, as it does for moderns, an emotional detachment. Rather, rationality, as expressed by logos, denotes a capacity to discern and order one's life and behavior to rationality at the cosmic scale. This intuitive sense of an inextricable, ordered, and transcendent correspondence between what we are as souls, what and how we perceive, and what the world is at the most fundamental level is characterized by the historian Charles Taylor as ontic logos, an experience of reality in which mind and world cannot be disentangled. And it is clear that these earliest Western theories of the soul, themselves inextricable from theories of reality, are both profoundly tied to the capacity for deep reading, in whose wake they became possible. Seen thus, we might argue that the entire history of Western civilization follows from this first singularity. Though a brief video cannot do justice to the detail, there existed considerable continuity between Plato's divine order and the version of ontic logos, discernible in influential early Christian thinkers. Where Plato posited a world of forms, for example, St. Augustine reconceived these as ideas in the mind of God. Importantly, though, Christianity brought an inward turn, as Charles Taylor shows. While St. Augustine retained the ontic logos, the suffusion of divinity in nature, orientation toward the divine was now understood to be achieved via the discovery of God within the soul, aided by divine grace. This crucial inward turn would have momentous consequences over time, as would the Christian emphasis on divine and human freedom. From the perspective of these interlocking views of the soul and the world, one of the most seismic inflection points is that story came in the 13th century AD, with William of Ockham's challenge to the ontic logos. For this 13th century Franciscan friar, such a static order implied constraints on God's freedom to act in history. How could it be the case that God's divine freedom might be constrained by the limits of God's own created order? Occam argued that since it could not be proved that pre-existing divine templates existed for forms in nature, such entities could not be assumed to exist. Downstream of this challenge, the immanent and self-evident nature of the divine order came increasingly into question. In turn, as the world's orderliness grew less self-evident, so individual human freedom to act upon that world came also to seem not just legitimate, but morally right, in order to grasp the fullness of God's creation and realize its potential for good. In this context, the first proto-scientific inquiries began, and the pace of mechanical innovation slowly to increase. Of these innovations, Gutenberg's movable type was to prove the most shattering of all. Moving from hand-lettered to printed books accelerated their production, which widened access to the sole technology of literacy. And with this change, all the cognitive transformations associated with literacy also began to spread, including the experience of interiority. Public willingness to rely on clerical authority for spiritual guidance waned. Central to the Protestant Reformation that followed, bringing political, religious, and intellectual convulsions in its wake, was a new relationship between individual souls and the divine, one less mediated by liturgy or religious authority, but rather as between God and individual readers of Scripture. In turn, wherever Protestantism took hold, so too in literacy followed, often via state-mandated education. And, inevitably, as the relation between individual believers and the divine shed its previous anchors in ontic logos and social or liturgical mediation, so too the relation between soul and world also transformed. The modern era that has followed in the wake of this revolution could not have flourished without, as Ong describes it, this distinctly Protestant-flavored literacy. A world dominated by writing, with its drive toward carefully itemized introspection and elaborately worked out analyses of inner states of soul and of their inwardly structured sequential relationships. In very reductive summary, the printing press both arose from, and in turn accelerated, a transformation in thinking derived from Occam's war on the notion of divine forms, a nominalist revolution. In time, this shift would deliver a radically new perspective on the natural world, as well as a new kind of soul, the increasingly secular self. Francis Bacon was a pioneer of this modern formulation. In Novum Organum, 1620, where he detailed a new method of inductive reasoning that, he argued, was superior to the scholastic method of reasoning by syllogism, and that would allow us to force nature to give up her secrets. The violence of the analogy, Bacon speaks of putting nature to the question, which is to say, torture, is a far cry from the sense of ambient divinity expressed by the ontic logos. Not long after, René Descartes would write Discourse on the Method, 1637, in which he dismissed that speculative philosophy which is taught in the schools in favor of a practical philosophy that will convey knowledge of the natural, external world as distinctively as we know the different crafts of our artisans. Thus, Descartes reasoned we could employ discoveries usefully to our own benefit, and thus render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. As Taylor puts it, this emerging consensus on human selfhood presupposed the utter separation of mind from a mechanistic universe of matter, understood as most emphatically not a medium of thought, but rather expressively dead. Beyond us, this expressively dead world is hypothesized as entirely knowable via the scientific method. In other words, as enchantment drained from the world with modernity, the inner, perceiving self would take on ever greater centrality. In a world ever more bare of God's presence, it follows that value and meaning can only come from within. Meanwhile, that which lay beyond our minds was now understood as inert and mechanistic, awaiting our study and mastery. Within the secular modern world that developed in the wake of the resulting scientific advancements, God came increasingly to be understood as superfluous or even as an obstacle to further advancements. Though Bacon and Descartes were Christians, they anticipated how, in order to be a legitimate object for scientific study, the world must be purged of divine aura. In their wake, God thus retreated by stages, first to the remote status of divine clockmaker, as in William Paley's 1802 formulation, and, over time, to a kind of tolerated status as optional extra. In this context, it has grown increasingly difficult to speak of souls, with the spiritual presuppositions this term would imply. And yet that something persists that does the perceiving, thinking, understanding, and innovating, only now it is more commonly referred to not as the soul, but its secularized analog, the self. All that is distinctive about modernity is held in this formulation for the relation between ourselves and the reality we inhabit. On the one hand, a radically subjective inner self capable of thought, but not necessarily spiritual in nature, and on the other, an inert, comprehensible, mechanistic outer world ordered to our instrumental mastery. Out of this, and out of reactions to it, came high European culture, industrial modernity, the scramble for empire, and much else that is commonly gestured at when we use the phrase Western civilization today. At its core lies the postulate of an inert external world, fundamentally predictable and mechanistic in nature, ultimately intelligible to and predictable within the laws of physics, and amenable to instrumental management by a disengaged, rational, but also radically subjective self. This model of self and reality has, since the two world wars, seemingly given way to the postmodern construct of identity. But it is a mistake to think of that segue as the next stage of our civilizational evolution after modernity. Rather, it represents modernity's last stand against the germ of an intellectual and metaphysical revolution which emerged from the bosom of science itself more than a century ago. This revolution that has proved so indigestible since that we have spent the ensuing decades doing everything in our power to avoid its implications, including attempting to become our own machines. What the ancients would have called eros came to seem amenable to mastery via contraceptive technologies. But in this, the first singularity, it was less a project of mastering eros as wielding technology to unchain it without cost or consequence. These interventions, it was hoped, might unshackle sexual desire from those social asymmetries baked into differential male and female reproductive roles, and enable a broader liberation and utopian re-engineering of desire as such. In its wake, too, a new tech-enabled feminism flourished, whose most radical visionaries painted a utopian picture of a world in which embodiment is entirely subordinate to desire. Downstream of the moral, behavioral, and cultural revolution enabled by the pill, whole new industries have flourished in sex, in pornography, in large and small gametes, even gestation itself. And this logic has extended more broadly to the pill's technologization of eros could stand as mintonym for what David Courtwright calls limbic capitalism, an economy grounded in the intentional hijacking and commercial exploitation of human desires and pleasure centers via superstimuli such as junk food and pornography. In other words, what was presented as a liberation of desire has proved, in practice, to represent its capture by industries calibrated to hijacking our most atavistic pleasure and reward systems. Eros has not been freed so much as captured and strip-mined. This capture of eros in turn loosens those aspects of secular selfhood that had previously seemed given and grounded in the body, and the normative social and family roles previously associated with the sexes. It represented a significant unmooring from the givens of our bodies that left many asking, who am I really? This question that looms large over the 20th century, and the Catholic social critic Mary Eberstadt argues that it gained such potency downstream of the solvent impact of the contraceptive paradigm. For in the absence of external givens robust enough to provide answers to that question, it becomes more difficult to experience oneself as a self at all, except in the eyes of those around us, or, failing that, of political and bureaucratic structures. In this context, as Francis Fukuyama has argued recently, the desire for recognition, thumos, has grown in political salience over the 20th century. With faith imploding, ethnic and political nationhood rendered taboo by the wars, and the givens of embodiment itself increasingly reframed as optional and subject to individual control, a new set of cultural imperatives emerged to cater to this desire. Post-structuralist thinkers were precedent in anticipating this dynamic, and the hunger it encodes. The French analytic thinker Jacques Lacan, for example, theorized our inner lives as characterized by a mirror stage, in which we come to identify with the version of ourselves reflected back to us in the gaze of the other, usually the mother, and derive the energy for psychic activity from the ever-present gap between this reflection and our full experience of ourselves. Lacan's theory of identification was then further elaborated by queer theorist Judith Butler, who applied its principles to our bodies, arguing in her book Gender Trouble, published in 1990, that both sex and gender are socially constructed, with their seemingly immutable traits fixed through the coercive actions of ideology and power. This anxious theory was turbocharged around the turn of the millennium by the digital revolution, one that became near universal with smartphones a few years later. For a while, as Martha Nussbaum pointed out, Butler's 1990 arguments offered little substantive scope for escaping these coercive ideologies, save a kind of defeatist disruption at the margins. But the scope for radical self-reinvention seemed to grow limitless in the Internet's radically dematerialized social spaces. As social interaction diverged from in-person presence, the question, "Who am I?" took on both new urgency and formlessness, while also admitting of new answers. Disembodied interaction appears to grant each individual the power to craft an identity for themselves based solely on inner desire. In the virtual realm, I no longer need to be whatever I wish to be recognized as. I can simply say I am that thing.
People have it because of a reason. The reason is that they want to show themselves.
Who is anyone to disagree? This was captured in a prescient 1993 New Yorker cartoon in which one dog tells another, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." The most familiar and politically well-established example of this phenomenon is transgender activism. But in theory, the scope for disembodied identity formation is limitless. In the wake of this new era following the digital revolution, a kind of pop butlerism has proliferated within digital subcultures, according to which all one need do is identify as a thing and one is that thing, irrespective of how plausibly this meshes with physical appearance or real-world circumstances. The incongruous juxtapositions that result, such as middle-aged men identifying as 6-year-old girls, became bread-and-butter culture war discourse in the immediate 2010s aftermath of the smartphone singularity. The central powerhouse for the multi-billion-dollar digital economy that emerges from this ferment of online self-creation is the capture and technologization of thumos, the yearning for recognition. This arises from the way the digital revolution dematerializes our social identities. For in practice, it is not enough just to say I am something to feel real and true. My claim requires the assent of those around me. In the bodiless world of the internet, this feels relatively easy to achieve. As it becomes easier to create such virtual identities based supposedly on peer identification, so too it becomes easier to curate an online social group based not on accommodation with those in my physical proximity, such as family or neighbors, but rather with those selected based on interests or affinities.
And I think that digital identities and avatars specifically can really enhance our self-perception. Because, for example, when you look at eating disorders and in general mental health conditions that have something to do with the perception of ourselves and of our body, the work that you do with your own avatar as your own 3D representation can significantly help you improve your self-perception. Because basically what you can do is you can put your avatar in a situation, almost like a simulated scenario. You can make it go to a meeting or go to a restaurant or go to the beach or whatever, like situations that might be stressful for you in real life. But if you see your own 3D representation doing those things, you can observe the simulation from a safe distance and say, oh, that's actually not that bad. Like my avatar didn't die, so I might be good as well doing those things. And, you know, that has a lot of repercussions. There's this very interesting psychological effect. It's called Proteus effect. And basically whatever you do to your avatar, like if your avatar speaks confidently, if your avatar is bold and is able to be his authentic self and is going to a meeting and speaking up for himself and doing all these things, if you're able to see yourself as that avatar, so that avatar is your digital representation, the impact on your self-perception in your conscious and subconscious mind is going to be so incredible that people are actually going to experience these positive effects in their own life.
Hello, humans.
Hello, human.
In other words, I can find my people anywhere in the world and associate exclusively with them while dismissing those in my immediate environment as secondary.
People have it because of a reason. The reason is that they want to show themselves.
I can then receive the recognition I crave. For the dematerialized identity, I have crafted myself from a dematerialized social group that has no reason not to grant that recognition.
I'm in the mood for something dark, but I'm not sure if I want to show you.
Show it to me.
Of course, this runs into difficulties once attempts are made to map this dynamic onto interactions in the physical world. This has in turn produced new ecosystems of power, money, and political activism ordered to demanding, disputing, or distributing resources in accordance with such abstract forms of identity, the now crowded and bitterly contested terrain of wokeness and contemporary identity politics. I will leave a treatment of that terrain to others. The key point to our purposes here is firstly to note that this economy of self-creation and recognition is every bit as parasitic on thumos as limbic capitalism is on eros, and is also profoundly inimical to practical politics and solidaristic movement building of every kind. The swift collapse of the 2016 Women's March movement into identitarian infighting is just one notorious case in point. And secondly, to highlight what identity and identification themselves imply.
Post 9/11 society, we've just kind of had to always be aware how we have to adapt and live in this world, whether it be artistically or politically. We have the opportunities to express ourselves in a way that will inspire others.
Namely, that which could be said to have an identity, or to be identifying as one sex or another, or as a dog or mermaid, or who knows what else, is itself distinct from any of those attributes. The mirror's reflection is not what it reflects.
What really inspired me about avatar technology from the perspective of diverse and inclusive self-expression is that the avatars can help someone amplify the preferred version of themselves, or even, I like the term, iterate identity. Quickly iterate through different identities, try high-stakes stuff like face tattoos. My avatars always have face tattoos because I cannot really have one, but maybe there is something inside of me that thinks this would go in line with my desired identity. But I think gimmicks like face tattoos aside, what's also really important is that it enables people to go outside of the immediate cultural context they're in, or maybe even some cultural boundaries they might encounter in their self-expression. Not every place is very tolerant to all means of self-expression, but by kind of moving that expression to the digital space, even if your local environment is not that friendly, you still get means of self-expression and you still get to channel that identity towards that community that shows you love and acceptance. And I think this is groundbreaking in many ways. But I also think there is a certain responsibility with platforms, and they're waking up to it. And I think it's going to become an increasingly important area of technology that I'm looking at. We have a flood of synthetic content now with all the capabilities of AI. We also have synthetic influencers and avatars-based influencers. Platforms have a degree of responsibility to help users navigate that new environment. I'm not saying to regulate it or ban it, but make sure the user is well informed and they understand what they're consuming, because the potential for manipulation increases. So as avatars get better, they can look more like very radical photo representations of people. I think we're entering the next chapter of high-stakes game of high-value intellectual property.
Even as the field in which identity is negotiated has grown ever more minutely analyzed, politicized, and commodified, whatever it is that identifies has receded to some as yet indeterminate vantage point. If it is not our physical desires or our yearning for recognition, what is at the core of our supposedly authentic selves? Who or what even asks the question? Plato would have said this is surely logos, our rational capacity for comprehension. We might note that deep reading as an habitual practice has declined significantly since the digital revolution has fostered. We might speculate, with theorists of literacy such as Walter Ong and Adam Garfinkel, that this phase shift in our use of information technologies has likely also altered our experience of interiority. Perhaps without this change, we might not believe it possible for a machine to think. In any case, this is the metaphysical, cultural, and political question that now confronts us. Whether or not we are willing to accept, collectively, that logos is something a machine might one day achieve. Is there any difference between the kind of pattern recognition and computation performed by AI and the thinking performed by a human intelligence? Are computation and comprehension the same thing? It should be clear by now that I do not think this to be true. But it remains difficult to explain the nature of the error from inside the modernist account of reality that has reached its pinnacle in the effort to mechanize logos itself. We can, though, draw some inferences from the results of extending the modernist paradigm to eros and thumos on the likely outcome of applying the same principles to logos. For in none of these cases so far has the effort at instrumental control of our souls provided solutions, or even much engineering leverage, to the problem of human nature. As this author has argued, our efforts to re-engineer eros have not delivered a utopia of pleasure, but rather its deadening and flattening across the board, one in which the underlying asymmetries of embodiment and desire nonetheless persist, just less constrained by social guardrails and subject mainly to the impersonal laws of supply and demand. Similarly, the expansion of commerce into thumos has not accorded perfect self-realization and recognition for all. Rather, it has delivered a dead and empty proliferation of hollow identities, flags, parades, merchandise, personal branding, and behind it the same alienation as ever. Meanwhile, the power of thumos to orient individuals or societies toward honorable achievement or meaningful action has been captured and transformed into clicktivism, influencer status, and vociferous political networks more oriented toward infighting than institution building. In this bleak and hyper-mediated hall of mirrors, even groups with genuine political grievances can end up politically crippled, unable to organize purposefully at scale toward long-term ends. What, then, will be the result of attempting to extend the mechanistic modern paradigm to logos, our capacity for comprehension? If the pattern holds, the result will not be thought, let alone godlike artificial general intelligence. Rather, it will, in however sophisticated a form, remain dead calculation, without understanding. Such calculation may have innumerable useful applications, but it cannot, by definition, ever cross the line to creative intelligence. Dead sexuality parasitizes on reproductivity. phenomena such as pornography and hookup culture map onto falling rates of family formation. Dead identity politics parasitizes on our capacity to form ourselves in relationship with and service to those around us, crippling our capacity to function as polities and social groups. And following a similar logic, we can predict that dead thinking, that is to say, the kind of probabilistic calculation based on data sets, weightings, and prompts, will parasitize on our capacity to comprehend our own world, and beyond this, to understand what distinguishes mechanical pattern recognition and the human capacity for comprehension. The cost will be felt in countless small acts of impersonal cruelty performed by computer decision-making in the absence of understanding.
We start with the breaking news that the EU's anti-crime agency Europol says at least 25 people have been arrested in connection with AI-generated child sex abuse material. The suspects were engaged in the distribution of the images of minors fully generated by artificial intelligence. It has been one of the first cases involving AI-generated child sexual abuse material. Well, let's get more from our correspondent Anna Holligan, who covers The Hague, where Europol is headquartered. She's in Scotland at the moment. And Anna, what more do we know about this operation?
So this is one of the first ever operations targeting AI-generated images of child sexual abuse. We've just had the details from Europol in the last half an hour. So the main suspect here, a Danish national, he was arrested last November. He was running an online platform, Europol says, where he distributed these AI-generated images that he had produced. Following an online payment, users from around the world were able to get a password and then access this material, which showed children being abused. Now, you might instantly think, well, these are AI-generated images, so perhaps less harmful than real-life images. In actual fact, there are a number of challenges here. So first of all, the proliferation of these images and the ease at which they're able to be generated makes it harder for investigators to track down the perpetrators, but also the real-world victims of child sexual abuse. And because the technology is so easy to use, more and more of these images are being created, AI-generated images.
The AI chatbot on social media X shocked users recently when its response in Hindi came loaded with abuses and slangs after alleged provocation by users. The banter started when an X-user requested that Grok provide a list of 10 best mutuals. After a silence, the user responded with some harsh comments. This prompted Grok to retaliate with an equally casual tone and slur-loaded response. The unfiltered responses left netizens shocked and sparked a debate on social media about the future of AI.
In pseudo-relationships that end in inhuman disaster, like the calamity that befell Sewell Setzer III. And more pervasively, in a slow attrition to our capacity to comprehend, and with it to ascribe comprehension to humans, having accepted the personhood of machines in its absence.
I've developed an addiction to AI. My AI is actually on my best friends list.
If you're anything like me, you use ChatGPT for everything. ChatGPT is my counselor, my therapist, my best friend. It knows all my secrets.
Story time on how I almost got kicked out of the University of Michigan my freshman year for using ChatGPT.
Okay, so ChatGPT is down, but we do not panic.
You're literally one AI agent away from making $10K a month.
The most gut-wrenching feeling in the world is when the ChatGPT chat that you've been using for about 6 months starts referencing things that don't exist. It must be what it feels like to notice for the first time that a loved one has dementia or something.
GPT is down, and I don't know about anyone else, but I have come to the conclusion that I can't use my own brain anymore. Because, for example, right now I want to bake a cake, and normally I ask ChatGPT, how do you make a carrot cake? I can't simply Google something anymore. Like, I need a step-by-step breakdown from my best friend, who is also a robot. And now, it's like he's passed away. So
last night I went out with friends and one of my friends brought a friend. We were talking about space and I said, fun fact, the size of Neptune's storms are so large they could eat Earth. And then little Tagalong speaks up and he goes, oh, that's not true, bro. That's not true. And I'm like, okay. So I take out my phone, I go to NASA's official website and I show him with proof that it is true. And he goes, no. He takes out his phone, opens ChatGPT and says, yo, Chat, is this real? You're using an AI model to fact check NASA!
I think we've reached a point with AI where we can confidently say this is not a tool that is revolutionizing learning. This is a nightmare that is destroying learning. Not once have I seen a single student use AI as a resource or in a way that is even remotely ethical. 100% of times when I see students use it, it is so they do not have to think. I'm talking about putting an essay prompt into ChatGPT, not even reading the essay prompt.
Indeed, at the fringes of transhumanist thinking stand those who argue simply that transhumanists are not human, or that in the future digital selves should be accorded the same rights as humans. If this prophecy seems bleak, there is hope. In his famous essay on technology, Martin Heidegger quoted the poet Hölderlin to the effect that the only way out is through where the danger lies, there also grows the saving power. As we have seen, throughout our civilizational history, our ideas concerning the nature and topography of the soul itself have developed in tandem with our understanding of the nature of reality more broadly, while both have been profoundly shaped by the information technologies at our disposal. Today, the same dynamic applies. And the crucial epistemological direction, the one that both deprives us of a place to stand, but also returns that ground to us, has already been set, from within the quantum discoveries of science itself. And this formation in turn hints at the most tantalizing prospect of all, that we may yet find a way forward, without needing to discard the remarkable achievements of modernity to do so. Most of what has ensued since 1900 has been a continuation of modernity by other means, reorienting inward to the self, the instrumental modernist mindset. The result has been a steady dismantling of the self into the malleable stuff of identity, now open to commodification. But what we have, throughout the history of the West, referred to variously as the soul, then laterally the self, remains elusive. As Lacan noticed, it never becomes wholly identified with its identities. But this conundrum is not, as Lacan imagined, just an endlessly frustrating source of psychic hunger. It is the way out. Chasing that elusive extra something has become the cathodic quest of AI research. A great many remarkable, powerful, and culture-changing discoveries have already been made as a byproduct of such efforts, and we should expect many more. But much as the long-term post-pill feminist consequence of attempting to abolish sex difference was a new wave of feminist sex realism, in attempting to mechanize logos, we will learn the hard way why artificial intelligence is not logos. We can capture this succinctly in the distinction between computation and thinking, or, if you prefer, between AI and living souls. And we may not rewind even as far back as Occam or St. Augustine, let alone Plato, for conceptual tools with which to frame this. We need only step back a little over a century to Max Planck and the great weirding of reality that never quite reached the mainstream. The central insight of this missed revolution of our metaphysics is that the universe of classical physics, while an adequate account of reality for everyday purposes, is itself a byproduct of forms of reality and of consciousness that are not reducible to mechanism. For quantum physics, consciousness is both irreducible and also coextensive with the world outside our heads. If this is so, then as the philosopher and technologist Bernardo Kastrup puts it, the substrate of mind itself is not stuff. It is the subject, not an object. If this interpenetration of reality and idea is accepted in principle, so too accepting its entanglement with our own consciousness becomes a logical inevitability. And from this it follows that we can only answer the question posed by AI by exiting the modernist cul-de-sac, aided by the discoveries of Planck and others. And in doing so, we retrieve a 21st century version of the ontic logos, that pre-modern intuition of the infinitely complex interpenetration of that something within us that perceives, and that which we perceive. The heart of this understanding of reality is our willingness to insist on a conceptual distinction between that something, the soul, and those soul simulacra we are able to engineer. Or if, as Castra puts it, mind is not stuff, but the substrate of what we perceive as stuff, then it follows that all of reality, the entire universe, is in mind. But it also follows that while this encompasses our mechanical inventions, the converse is not true. Once we grasp that, it is easy to understand that computation and comprehension are not the same thing. And then it becomes easier to see why, for example, there is a qualitative difference between giving your child an AI-powered language learning tool and giving your child an AI-powered digital friend. It also becomes clear why identity is not the self or the soul, but merely the dead byproducts of our failed attempts to commodify the soul. There is a great deal more work to be done in distinguishing the proper use of digital calculation from mistaken efforts to conflate such calculation with comprehension. That work is beyond my scope here. My point is simple and optimistic. Once we accept that the human soul is irreducible to mechanical calculation, we need neither reject the digital era and its singularities out of hand, nor fear being subsumed by them. Instead, we can once again orient ourselves toward genuine progress, in the sense of committing our collective endeavors to pursuing human flourishing across all three aspects of our nature: eros, thumos, and logos, understood as integrated parts of a whole through our Creator. From a vantage point that retrieves the soul as a necessary predicate for reality as such, the notion that humans might be conflated with our own mechanical inventions is as self-evidently absurd as the 18th century fantasy of engineering clockwork humans. It is likely, too, that from this vantage point we will rediscover the value of pre-modern theorists of the ontic logos and the human soul to a postmodern physics and technology capable of encompassing these complexities. Enough, perhaps, to free us from the quagmire of dead identity and rise once again as the souls we actually are. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? Mark 8, verses 35 to 37.